Turkish investors.
Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I am hugely terrific.
You're looking great. I like your shirt.
You too, man. I'm trying to keep up with you.
Well, I guess the feeling is mutual. Thank you so much. A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. Today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but I will probably start at home here in the Washington, where President Donald Trump just came back from the G20, and along the way he went crossed into North Korea and met with the North Korean leader, Chairman Kim Jong-un. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that when you look at it, you look at the optics. It doesn't look like it was something that was suddenly done. I think that there had been perhaps a lot of kind of like behind the scenes diplomacy that was able to agree and make those types of arrangements. And to be very honest with you, I think it was a huge symbolic accomplishment for both the presidents, and especially the President of the United States, because he is the first U.S. president to be able to do that. But then again, there are some people who are wondering, where is the beef?
That's a good question, Shaka. I was about to ask you the same thing. People, critics alike are saying that it was just for show, for the cameras, but nothing substantive came out of the talks.
Yeah, of course, I'm reminded by what was, I think, a primary political debate among the Democrats, and it involved the former Vice President Walter Mondale, who was the vice president for Jimmy Carter. He was debating with a gentleman by the name Gary Hart. They talked, and Gary Hart seemed to be making, Walter Mondale seems to be making, I think, a point. And Gary Hart from nowhere said, but where is the beef? So you have to think in terms of what are the consequences, what are the benefits of this apparently symbolic, huge accomplishment of at least breaking that political ice.
At least you and I agree that despite the politics, the symbolic gesture of the President Donald Trump going into North Korea is a big deal.
Yeah, it is, I think. Let's face it, by any standard.
Okay, let's cross over. Let's walk to Africa. Let's start maybe in Rwanda. As we speak today, a Rwandan has been jailed here in the United States for immigration fraud. But apparently, this same Rwandan by the names of Jean Leonard Teganya was involved in the genocide, but those charges did not come up here. You've read about the case, maybe bring us up to speed.
It is for lying about the genocide that he apparently may have taken part in back in 1994 in Rwanda. And the judge decided that that probably was not the kind of crime that could be tried on U.S. soil. And so he decided to pretty much stick to the immigration law. This is a gentleman who had apparently run away from Rwanda in 1994, ended up in Canada, and tried to get political asylum in Canada, and it didn't work out for him. Eventually, he actually had to run away from Canada and crossed into the United States. And when he crossed into the United States, he had to run into the immigration and customs authorities and all that kind of stuff. And he eventually so, basically filed for political asylum. And eventually, I think the investigators found a lot of stuff that they didn't feel comfortable with. And now he's been imprisoned, sentenced.
What are those forces that push a young guy like him? When he came over here, he was a young guy, obviously, but now maybe not so. What are some of the forces, I mean internally and externally, that are pushing some of these people to run away from their beloved country?
Well, in this particular case, there was genocide. So there was war. There had been civil war. There was violence. There was a lot of things that one probably didn't feel comfortable, living with really. And in his particular case, he happened to be a member of the Hutu majority, who, at least by almost every standard, they were condemned for having essentially been behind the genocide that killed a lot of Tutsis. Even though eventually what happens is that you did have an international criminal court based in Arusha, Tanzania, in the northern Tanzanian town of Arusha, which was called the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And in fact, they ended up trying basically people who were one-sided, to the extent that it is not really considered to be something that you could call justice, because in their view it was selective justice. And others in fact have said it basically surely comes to what you would characterize as victors' justice.
Speaking of victors' justice, President Paul Kagame, who has had the privilege of serving that country for over 20 years now, he's been comfortably talking about how a lot of people died, and you speaking about victors' justice. Some of his critics say that what he speaks about is the victors' justice. But recently he was appearing on a French television, and he was asked a question about the human rights in Rwanda, his human rights record in Rwanda. And for some reason, the president lost his cool, and he just couldn't in a way, he stood his ground, tried to defend his position about the human rights in Rwanda. You watched the clip, maybe bring us up to speed.
I have to say, first of all, it was a very interesting and not particularly interesting type of interview. To be very honest with you, and to be fair to the Rwandan President Paul Kagame, he seemed to actually have a legitimate point. Criticizing, for example, the manner in which the West in general, and in this particular case, the European Union in particular, in which it deals with Africa, for example, how it plays the role of the judge. And the African simply seems to be like a victim of sorts like that. But I think that he really has to be careful in the sense that he's not talking only on his own behalf as Major General Paul Kagame, retired but certainly not tired. He is a president of a country, and he talks really on behalf of the dignity of more than 10 million Rwandese. And not forget that not long ago, he also happened to be the chairman of the African Union, which means that he actually is carrying on his back the dignity of the more than 1 billion Africans, especially because he is chairman of the African Union. If you are a president, you are a president of a country, and therefore it is not about you. It is about the people that you actually lead. You basically owe them, and you talk on behalf of their dignity. And in fact, when you think about it, he could still have made his point very well, but without necessarily really being very angry and without being seen to be very emotional. And at some point, he even, in fact, tried to be a little to personalize things to the extent that he sort of tried to blame the journalist, the female journalist who was interviewing him on behalf of France 24 television. And let's face it, he was also on an interview with a commission, if I remember correctly, of the European Union. The European Union, in fact, gives a lot of aid to developing countries, and in this particular case, Rwanda. And I think that if you give aid, you should also perhaps have a right to find out or be concerned about how that particular aid is being used. In other words, accountability. So I think that Mr. Kagame should try to be conscious of the fact that when he speaks, really, he speaks on behalf of the dignity of the millions of people that he leads.
How about those people who said that maybe he was right? The West or the United States or any other country should not be there to police what he does or doesn't do in Rwanda. That when he's speaking for Rwandans, the things they have done. Every country has a policy or ways in which they deal with human rights. He gave examples of how the West or the United States cannot look themselves in the mirror.
Yeah, I think you should do that. I mean, you can do that, but you see, at the end of the day, it's not so much about what you say, but perhaps how you actually say it. You know, when we talk about, for example, the genocide, we look at the Western media characterizing the Africans who are involved in this genocide using machetes to kill each other and what have you, and pangas and you name it. And of course, one may also ask you, what about, for example, those particular individuals who were in fact flying those jet planes which dropped, for example, the atomic bomb on Japan?
The Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what have you. Would you consider them? I was watching 60 Minutes and somebody was wondering whether you could also characterize them as savages, because you actually characterize the Africans who are killing each other as savages. And someone said, no, they may not necessarily be savages, actually. They are instead patriotic, and they are following instructions from above, from their leadership, that kind of stuff. It's not that killing one another is a good thing. It's not a good thing. But I think that he has to be very, very careful in the manner in which he talks and what kind of words he uses, because the same European Union, the same Europeans that he was critical of, were actually very supportive of him after the genocide, especially when they decided to choose what kind of forum is going to be trying the people who perpetrated the genocide and who it should try. In fact, there was a critic who was saying, how come, for example, he did not criticize the European supporters and the international community for the manner in which they decided how the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was going to go against its cases, to the extent that it ended up, in fact, being what critics now observe was a victor's justice, selective justice, not for everybody, because it's not only the Hutus that were involved in killing.
I think I will leave it at that. Let's maybe continue. Let's go to Kenya. Some sad news came out of London yesterday. A stowaway fell from a plane that came from Nairobi to London. We don't know the details or the circumstances surrounding his death, but what we know, the reporting that I've seen, they talk about a body being found nearby Heathrow Airport in London, and the plane was coming from Kenya. Maybe could you speak to that?
Incredible. I don't know whether the plane was actually coming from Kenya, but what I know is that it was Kenya Airways.
Correct.
You know, I always used to hear and read about stories about stowaways, especially coming from Africa, trying to get their way to Europe, to the greener pastures, and in fact going to school and what have you. I read about some individuals who used to do that from Nigeria, for example. I also met, I was very fortunate enough to meet one individual, gentleman in Uganda, who had actually been the beneficiary of that type of experience. He ended up leaving Uganda and ended up in India, where he studied to be an accountant. And in fact, he ended up being the municipality council or town council treasurer of Jinja by the name Kasibwa.
Interesting.
It was very interesting when he talked about that. A stowaway, of course, is someone who basically gets into a ship, gets into a plane or a vehicle for the purpose of traveling secretly to go to whichever kind of destination he or she wants to go without actually having to go through the business of paying and all that kind of stuff. But it is incredible. I mean, how can you possibly do it in this modern day and age, especially when you look at the kind of security that obtains on some of these international airports? How do you do it? What? You either have to, it either has to be an inside job in the sense that you probably work for the airline, or you work for the security around that particular airport, or of course you buy your way.
I mean, it's interesting because in 2014 there was a teen here in the United States, a Somali teen, who did a similar thing and he survived. So there are cases of people who have done that and survived. But let's go to a quick reaction here from Adrian Pabi. Risking your life for greener pastures is a do-or-die battle. Your thoughts?
Yeah, but you know, there is a saying, Paul, that it is only those who are willing to fail greatly that succeed enormously. Life is about a risk because, let's face it, all of life is about, someone said, passion, action, and reaction. And to ignore the passion, action, and reaction of your time or your generation is to risk having not really lived at all, occupying space. So does that person think that a person should occupy space, not trying to sacrifice or to go through some, some problems in order for that particular individual at the end of the day to end up actually doing something very reasonable and important for him?
Well, that I think that's a perfect segue to our next. I think what you just talked about, to ignore your passion, is something that sort of resonates with a lot of people. I remember talking to Bob Colmo, the Safaricom chief executive, who just died yesterday of cancer. And one of the things, a remarkable guy, by the way, who led Kenya's M-Pesa from its infancy to what it's become. It's by far the best mobile money platform that is out there. I remember one time in 2014, I was interviewing him, and he told me, I asked him one of the things why M-Pesa was doing very well. He told me something along the lines of ignoring your passion. So I challenged him. I said, what has made Safaricom a successful company? He said that we've gone to places where other people don't want to go. And I said, what's the best advice you'd give to a person who is willing to maybe to risk their lives? He said, you know what? We spend a lot of time talking about things that don't matter, but we spend less time about things that really matter. If you have a passion, you feel that that thing is going to take you places, go for it. So I think maybe in connection to what you're just talking about, that's relevant, especially when young people are hopeless and they are looking for hope. They have to go abroad.
You know, Bob was an incredible man, an incredible business manager, an incredible chief executive officer. And of course, he is credited for perhaps having led one of a few Kenyan companies, really, that have become incredibly successful. The last time I checked, the company that he led is now worth, by some estimate, about $11 billion. Can you believe that?
Right.
And this was a man of the people.
Right.
By the way, he was from Guyana, born in Guyana, but was,
but a Kenyan at heart.
In terms of nationality, he was British, but he was also a man of the people, a man who, for example, did things that not many peers of his could even think or dream about. He was the kind of person that respected his customers to the extent, for example, that he would actually catch a bus, ride a bus in Nairobi to go to the slums, to go to neighborhoods of these poor people who were his customers, who obviously contributed enormously to the success of his corporation. He was this kind of guy that would take a bus, take a ride, go to the slums, go to their neighborhoods, go and interact with them. He was also a man that would, for example, go, in situations where nobody really could even think about. He cleaned his company in terms of corruption and all that kind of stuff. He was a man who raised funds. He basically raised funds for supporting drought victims, for supporting people who were sick and did not have insurance and what have you. He was an incredible man. I don't know what is in the soil of Guyana, Paul, because there are other two very interesting people that trace their origins from Guyana, who also were, when you think about how they essentially lived their lives, it was not about them. It was about others. And this reminds me of a great scholar, intellect, Professor Dr. Walter Radney, the author of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He was from Guyana.
Yeah,
I don't know what is in that soil. You have Kojo Nandi, a great broadcaster, on NPR here and all that kind of stuff. So it looks like there is something particularly interesting in the soils of Guyana.
Speaking of how Europe underdeveloped Africa, let's go to a comment from Jerome. Jerome happens to be my dad's name, so that one I can't forget. What's the difference between African and European politics? But before you answer that, the best advice Bob ever gave me was that don't be afraid to take risks. Go to places where other people are willing or are not willing to go. If you really want to succeed, don't go to places where everybody is already doing business. Go to places, for example, that people are even afraid to walk to a bank. And that's why M-Pesa has succeeded across Africa, or mobile money transfers have succeeded because they go to places where people are afraid to go to.
It has succeeded in the sense that it has also triggered, for example, a lot of interest from some other institutions that have embarked on pretty much the same idea. You're talking about MTN and what have you. I told you earlier that it is only those who are willing to fail greatly that succeed enormously. Ted Turner, the founder of CNN.
My hero.
Your hero. The hero of a lot of people. He will tell you, for example, that when he actually came up with this idea of CNN, people were thinking he's crazy. People were saying, who the hell is going to waste their time watching news 24/7?
Yep.
Look, the last time I checked, CNN is one of the major international television or media organizations known to man. CNN. And there are so many people who have dared to fail. There are so many people who have stretched the envelope. There are so many people who have said, you know what, I can do it.
Yeah, okay, let's go back to the commenter from, the question from Jerome here. What's the difference between African and European politics?
Politics is the same whether it is African or whether it is European or whether it is American. Because politics really, when you think about it, it is essentially about who gets what, when, where, and why. It is also something that could be described as the art of all possibilities. It is something that can actually make the impossible possible. It can also equally make the possible impossible. But at the end of the day, it all involves human beings. I think what is different in Europe, when you look at Europe and you compare and contrast with Africa, is that Europeans have been lucky in the sense that they have had slightly more access, more unfettered access, for example, to information, to knowledge, to education. They have been exposed slightly more than the African. And because of that, they have been able, for example, to learn how to behave in a manner that respects the other. It's about facts. They have accepted the fact that everyone, for the most part, has a right to own an opinion, no matter whether it is different, for example, from the ruling party or from the government in power at that time. So long as you actually can state your point logically, using facts, because whereas it is true that everyone is entitled to their opinion, no one is entitled to their different sets of facts. Facts are facts. So Europeans have reached the point where, for example, they can in fact agree to disagree.
Interesting. What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa? Very briefly.
Tomorrow we are looking at the relationship between Africa and the United Nations. There are some people who say the United Nations, especially highest policy-making body, the UN Security Council, is not democratic. Yet you do have another branch of the United Nations, which is called the United Nations General Assembly, which is democratic in the sense that it actually elects people who become presidents of that particular body. But unfortunately, the UN General Assembly has teeth that do not bite. It has no power. The power belongs to the UN Security Council, which is in charge of basically responsible for peace and international security, and yet is controlled by 5 permanent members. You're talking about the United States, you're talking about China, you're talking about the United Kingdom, France, and China.
Well, on that note, we have to end our show right here. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Yep.